and welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your only available in a physical edition host, Madelyn.
I'm your limited time offer on streaming host, Emma.
And thanks for tuning in to this side quest episode of Talk This.
Yeah.
It's Emma's week to pick our topic for our podcast that I refuse to call a deep dive, but that I haven't come up with another alternate title for more than a year in. And I'm really excited for what we're going to be talking about today. I feel like every time we pick one of these, there's something that happens that's relevant, that makes it even more relevant, that pops up during the week. And this is no exception. So, Emma, what are we going to be discussing in this week's episode?
So, today we are discussing the very exciting and sexy topic of of video game ownership. In terms of, what does it mean to buy a game versus what does it mean to own a game, for instance. It's sounds super exciting, I know. And I think we should preface it with neither of us are lawyers or big tech people.
This
right?
may come as a surprise.
Yeah, I know this may be shocking. But while I think I have a pretty good understanding of the broad strokes, there are probably some nuances that we're missing here. Because it is not our profession.
And if you are a lawyer listening or a big tech person listening, we'd love to hear about some of those nuances from you. And by all means, send us a message about all of the things that we absolutely misunderstood and misrepresented to our listeners after the fact.
It's always good to do your own research, folks.
Hey. Well, Emma, what made you want to pick this? I think it's interesting. Every time you've mentioned this to me, you've been like, is this boring? Like, what a boring, dull topic. I think it's interesting. I don't know. But Emma, what inspired you to pick this topic for this week?
Well, there's all these console announcements happening, because they're coming out in November. And both Microsoft and Sony are releasing versions of their console that are digital only. So in Microsoft's case, it's a lower powered box that is mostly just, I think, meant to be a Game Pass machine, because that is what they're interested in selling. Whereas Sony's is pretty much the same thing, it just doesn't have a disk drive, so it's a little cheaper.
I like the communications major in you coming out with the great marketing copy of a lower powered box. Just really compelling, really good stuff.
Hey, I really think they should be called Chonky Xbox and Teeny Xbox, not Xbox.
It would lead to less confusion, although maybe all of those trendy pieces about how people bought the wrong console seem to have been a little overblown.
The Xbox One X sales went up pretty significantly on Amazon when pre-orders opened.
Right, that's what I'm saying, though, is I know there were a bunch of, pieces on everybody made a mistake, and I'm sure that did happen to some people, but I have a feeling that was... that not as many people as those stories made it seem made that error.
Sure. I mean, it's not... These names are not issues for people who play games and are interested in games. This isn't the topic, but whatever. This name are issues for moms who are going in to GameStop to buy a system for their children.
But see, and this does seg into being on topic, isn't that why we need stores like GameStop? So that we can have disinterested, teenage and 20-something retail employees who will at least guide the mom to something that is probably mostly what she wanted.
Well, maybe not a place exactly like GameStop, because they do have their own host of problems. But I'm pretty sure we're going to see GameStop disappear. Definitely sometime this decade. Probably the first half of this decade.
I mean, along with the rest of the United States, am I right? Anyway, let's talk about digital gaming. Let's get more on topic. We're already off topic in our first 5 minutes of the episode, so this is boding really well. So, Emma, do you want to kind of walk through kind of our various, like, how do you own it? Like, what are the different ways you can buy a game for the moms out in the audience who need to understand this?
Sure. So, especially nowadays, there's a lot of different options for buying games, right? Like, you've got your traditional physical media, right? You stood in line at GameStop at midnight, and you picked up your box. It's got a disc in it, and you stick your disc into your system of choice. And then you have it, right? You've got the game, it's on a disc, you put it in the box. More and more recently, especially with PC gaming, there's a lot of digital options, which means that you go onto a storefront like Steam or PlayStation 4 or Xbox, and you buy the game that you want. And especially with lots and lots more indies being made compared to the early days of gaming, there's lots and lots of games that are only available through digital sales, unless they happen to get like picked up by Limited Run at some point. And then there is also sort of the streaming / subscription services. Some of these are actually streaming in that you are streaming a game. Some of these are like you are paying for access to download this game. But they both are like, here's a bunch of games on this service. You can play these games if you subscribe to this service. So stuff like PlayStation Now and Xbox Game Pass are pretty much the equivalent of like Netflix or Spotify, for instance.
Well, Xbox Game Pass, I will clarify, I think you still have to download the games for that service.
Yeah, but you in the same way, like, if you had a game downloaded from Xbox Game Pass and it went off of Xbox Game Pass, you don't have access to that game anymore.
Oh, for sure. I'm mostly making the distinction because it's sort of my understanding, and the topical thing that I was thinking of, you know, making this even more relevant than it always is Amazon just announcing their game streaming service Luna this week. And of course the ever-looming juggernaut in the games industry that is Google Stadia, that has just, you know,
it's
changed
still
the
there.
entire game.
It's still there. It still exists.
But it's my understanding that right now, I mean, maybe it is here, and I just don't have the hardware, and most people don't have the hardware, but that right now the technology for streaming games is straining to keep up. And that hopefully in the next, 5 years or so, game streaming becomes something that's more accessible widely. But that, like, on the hardware that I have, streaming games is probably not really feasible. I mean, we'll see what happens with the Amazon
even
service.
Just beyond, like, the hardware that you have or what technology is actually put into the streaming of it, the United States does not have very good internet across the country, right? Or you have to pay exorbitant amounts for good internet. And to stream games regularly, you have to have good internet service. And that's just not like a widely available thing in the West right now, or in a lot of countries. But thinking about the United States in particular, like, there's a lot of places that just don't have consistent internet.
Emma's just bitter that her new customer discount is expiring.
No, my internet, minus some weird blips this week, has been mostly fine for the amount that I use it for, right? But if you were streaming games, like, every day for a month, your internet would start to choke up on you, probably.
Yeah, you'd hit your data cap.
Yeah.
Right away.
Yeah.
So some subscription services are streaming based. So like PlayStation Now, man, I can forget that PlayStation Now is a thing. Yeah. But PS Now is a streaming service. This new thing from Amazon Luna is streaming. Google Stadia is streaming. Nvidia has one that I can't remember what it's called.
It's not very catchy.
Something, right? That's streaming. And then stuff like Game Pass
GeForce Now is what it's called, I think.
It's like almost too catchy, GeForce Now. It's like a little too like on the nose of like, I'm a cool title.
I guess so.
And then something like Game Pass or Apple Arcade, I think, are you like download the games.
Yeah.
So obviously there are downsides to that, namely that you have to have the storage space for it, which I face acutely on my Switch that I'm not willing to buy a card for, and so I just delete games as I run out of space. But it does mean that it's right there, and it's much less of a strain on your internet and your hardware, and the latency you deal with is substantially less unless you're on crazy powerful internet somewhere.
Yeah.
So Emma, like, why not let's just go all digital? It's so convenient.
So, the issue with a lot of digital storefronts, or people used to see this at least as a very large issue, is that you're not actually purchasing the game when you buy it. You are purchasing a license to use the game through that storefront. So when you buy something on Steam, you're not actually buying yourself a version of the game that you can just, move anywhere and play anywhere. All of the games you buy on Steam require Steam to play.
That's not true, actually. I was reading that. There are some games on Steam that you can move to, like, other services.
Sure.
Depending on the developer, but you still can't just, like, do anything you want with them.
Yeah. So, theoretically, if Valve ever shut down, you would likely lose access to all the games in your Steam library. Because you don't own them.
But Emma, I paid for them. How do I not own them if I paid for them?
You did more of the legal research, I guess, so why don't you explain that part?
Okay, so I'll do my best. Again, with the caveat of, like, no one here's a lawyer,
yeah.
Right? But you know those user agreement terms that you sign anytime you buy something that you read carefully and scroll all the way to the end on, and you understand all of your rights very clearly when you check the I agree button?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's where this is. So, I'm trying, like, licenses are also really controversial in other software arenas. Like, I periodically see people be really pissed about things like Microsoft Word or any of the Adobe products.
Oh, yeah, like Photoshop, like...
You can't buy it anymore.
You can't use older versions of Photoshop anymore. You're not allowed to if you bought it previously.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
And people get mad about. Sort of same deal, right? If you're doing theatrical licensing, here's where my expertise gets to shine. Just because I paid for the right to do Our Town on November 17th, 2022, doesn't mean that I now, like, own Our Town and can do it whenever I want. And in theater, that makes a lot of sense. And in games, it feels like trickier, right? Mm-hmm. Because nothing about the stuff that you're interacting with in an online storefront makes it really clear to you that you don't actually own the game. In the same way that you would if you owned a physical disc. Now, like, there's some stuff that's like, well, with a physical disc, like, technically you are sort of just purchasing a license in a different format. And the real thing is that with a physical disc, it's just, like, way harder to police, basically. But the place where this gets sort of tricky is in dealing with your right as a consumer to resell that license or that game. So obviously, and GameStop built their entire model on this, right? Obviously, the used game market in physical games is huge. I mean, shrinking every year, right?
Yeah.
But still huge, gigantic part of how GameStop at least used to function, still functions to some extent, but a gigantic part of how they were functioning when they were a successful company, as opposed to a company that is, like, struggling to keep above water.
Yeah.
Was in allowing people to trade in their games and giving you pennies on the dollar and then selling them at a discounted price. And courts have kind of ruled that that's legal, right? If you own the physical media, it's your right to be able to resell it, and that's not controversial. But this gets really tricky with digital media, because if I own a game on Steam, I don't really have a way to resell it. Even though there have been a couple of major court cases in Europe that say that you should have the right to resell digital games.
Yeah, specifically in France, I think.
One of them, there's an earlier one that was like the European Union as a whole in 2012. And then most recently, I think in 2019, there was a big ruling that's like Valve specifically, was not allowed to ban this, basically. Yeah. But that doesn't go as far as like requiring that Steam has like a reselling marketplace, right? So even though, at least in Europe anyway, you're definitely legally allowed to resell e-material like games or like ebooks and stuff like that, there's like not a way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about like there's tons of games I have on Steam that either I'm done playing or don't want to play, but I can't do anything to pass those on to someone else that maybe I would want to play that game, or make a little bit of money. I can just sell my trading cards if I want to on the marketplace.
Yeah, what's so interesting about Steam is they basically already have the infrastructure to do this if they wanted to, because they already have this trading card marketplace, which I don't understand. I mean, whatever. Do what brings you joy.
I've made 5 cents off it before.
Nice. Proud of you.
It gets added to my Steam wallet, so next time I buy a game, it's a 5-cent discount.
You're a high roller. So Steam basically already has the infrastructure to be able to do this if they wanted to. The problem is that, of course, they do not want to.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of reasons for that. Should I get into this right now? I'm like monologuing a lot here. I can throw this to you.
I mean, I guess we can get into it. Like, when you would resell, like, they wouldn't make any money off of it. Right? That's, like, the main issue behind anything, right? And Steam, in particular, takes a pretty hefty cut from developers that sell on their platform, which is part of the reason that Epic is an interesting addition to the mix, because they take about, like, half the cut that Steam does, for instance.
Which is something like 30% versus 15% if you're looking for, an idea of what that is.
Steam is definitely 30%. I cannot remember the specifics of what Epic Game Store takes away. But it's like that's a significant margin, especially for smaller developers. So Steam definitely wants you to encourage you to buy it new through their store page so that they can take that hefty chunk of profit that is being sent their way.
And then on top of that, you really need the publisher to agree to it as well. So not only do you need to, convince Steam, who, I feel like Steam or Valve could, eventually, if they saw enough value in this reselling marketplace, they would still be able to take a cut of the resale money.
Sure.
Right? So I think that there would be a potentially winning business model for them there. Especially given that Steam, operates on crazy sales all the time anyway. But you also, because of the kind of agreements that you sign, authorizing your license, the publisher would also have to agree for this to happen. At least as it stands right now. And that is really tricky and a really weird balance to think about. Because, of course, if I take my copy, purely hypothetical, if I take my copy that I accidentally got 2 copies of because Amazon made a mistake of Super Mario Odyssey to GameStop and I get credit for it, obviously Nintendo doesn't see, and then GameStop resells it, Nintendo doesn't see a cent of that.
Yeah.
Same thing with, like, well, libraries and stuff like that. But in digital, that becomes a much bigger opportunity cost for the companies than it does in the used physical game market. Because at least theoretically, with physical games, there's a risk to buying a game used, or there's a quality deterioration. Like, you don't get the original case, maybe, or the manual when games used to have manuals, or there's a possibility the game is scratched or doesn't work, or is somehow inferior to buying it new.
Yeah.
And over time, as I'm sure Emma will talk about later, right, all kinds of media kind of deteriorate over time. Like, there's only so many times I could resell that copy of Super Mario Odyssey before something happened to it that made it unplayable or unusable or just at least, like, undesirable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, until somebody decided that somebody lost it or something like that, too. Any of those possibilities. As opposed to if you're reselling a digital game, like, there's no deterioration at all. You're buying something that might as well be out of the box new. And with the exception of, obviously, like, if I were to buy, like, a used digital, I don't know, like, PS2 didn't have digital games, right? But, like, if I were to buy, like, a used digital PS3 game or something, there might be a deterioration in value because, like, do I have a PS3? Well, I do, but, like, there might be a deterioration in value in that capacity in terms of presumably there aren't too many digital sales for PS3s that happen anymore for new games. But you're getting a product, in most cases, that is exactly identical to what you would buy if you bought directly from the publisher. So that makes allowing this to happen a tough sell. Because obviously it's way more complicated economically than this, but, like, if somebody is buying it used, that you're just losing money.
Yeah.
On someone who might have paid full price.
Yeah.
No, I can't balance the, like, well, what if they wouldn't have bought it all? But, there's that possibility too.
Yeah.
And so even if you come up with a version of this and there is a version of this that exists that uses blockchain and looks scary to me, but I was reading an article about this thing called Robot Cash, which is a platform, cash, like, not like dollars, like the computer thing, that uses blockchain, and anything that uses blockchain, I start to fuzz out a little bit.
Yeah.
For no reason, I just think of, like, Cooking Mama. Whenever there's blockchain in anything, I'm like, remember when Cooking Mama was mining blockchain? But it does allow, it has a really limited lineup of games, because it had to be publishers that agreed to it. But it has a resale platform, but you only get 25% of the resale. 70% goes to the publisher, 5% goes to the platform. Now that almost actually works, right? Because theoretically in that case, the publisher is getting the amount that they would have gotten on Steam.
Yeah.
But it kind of blows for you, because you only get 25% of what it went for.
Yeah.
So obviously it shows, like, there's some ways to get publishers to agree to this, but it's a really tricky value proposition, and it probably ends up with you getting a lot less than you would if you had a physical game.
Yeah.
Because, of course GameStop is notorious for giving you, like, 3 cents for a game, right? But, like, if you bring it, like, when I brought in Super Mario Odyssey, I got, like, $40 in credit or something, which is not what they're going to sell it for. Like, they're going to sell it for more than that, but, it's not me getting $15.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I turned in some Switch games recently, like, last winter recently, I guess. And I got a pretty decent chunk of change for that. Like, I think I got, like, $35 for Octopath Traveler, so, which is, more than half than what I paid for it originally. So that can be a boon for consumers. I think you touched on this, but yeah, a lot of this issue comes down to the fact that anything that the storefront would do would need to be run past the publisher of the games. So, like, people have talked about, like, Valve theoretically shutting down, right? And maybe they could do something before shutting down that would make your games available without Steam. But more likely they could do something that would make Valve games available without Steam. But anything else would need to be run through the publisher of the game, which would mean that with all of the games on Steam, it would be like talking to every single publisher that has ever made a game or developer, right? Like, they can't just put down like a blanket statement to that, because everybody who's on Steam would have to also agree.
Yeah, it gets really tricky because, of course, Steam, I mean, I have no numbers for this, but it feels almost for sure Steam has got to be the most widely used version of any kind of like a DRM that exists anymore. And of course, it's, very low key and you don't think about it, but Steam is checking that you are you and that you are using the game with the license that is assigned to you.
Yeah.
When you set up. Which feels like as good an excuse as any to dive deep into history of like 2007 to 2012, when DRM was everybody's bogeyman.
The olden days. So yeah, DRM is the evolved version of Secure ROM.
No, Secure ROM is a type of DRM.
Okay. Well, the current DRM, which doesn't have a name, I guess, that I found referenced at least, had evolved from what was most popular at the time, which is Secure ROM, which is a particularly bad piece of DRM software. In that there were a lot of people complaining, at least, that it slows down game performance and causes all these different issues with the game. As well as basically being like, you have like a certain number of times you can download this, basically.
Yeah, Secure ROM was really the devil in like 2007 or so. Yeah. I mean, there was like class action lawsuit about Spore and the DRM. And I do feel like the focus then was on things that we now pretty much take for granted. Namely, like you said, the big thing with things like Secure ROM was that it only allowed you to install the game on a certain number of computers.
Yeah.
Which is problematic from the like resale perspective, but also sometimes just caused problems of like people who had a bunch of computers or who replaced their computer or something like that and then couldn't reinstall. So that was a real problem. And then there was also, and this isn't necessarily specifically Secure ROM, it covers a bunch of different DRM software from that period, but there were also several games that were really maligned because they had always online requirements.
Right. Yeah.
Even for games where you were playing single player offline.
Yeah.
Which in 2007 is really problematic, right? Because people like weren't always necessarily online in the same way we are now.
Yeah.
And now it's like, well, yeah, of course I have to be online. I have to remember to have turned my Steam to offline mode if I want to play a game on an airplane. And that makes me roll my eyes, but I don't think of it as like my liberties are being infringed on.
I guess I didn't connect this until now, but it's like how you could only have like your iTunes account on a certain number of computers.
Yeah.
And that was always inconvenient because you'd have to figure out how to disallow one of your old computers because you forgot to uninstall it, because usually when you replace your computer, it's because it's busted and you can't do anything to it anymore.
Yeah, I remember that being a real pain with like like having to figure out how to deactivate old iPhones.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's like the kinds of things that were issues in the space of copyright protection like 10 years ago are now things that I feel like, and I saw this in your notes and some of the readings as well, the marketplace just like doesn't even notice anymore. Like, of course I can't install the game I download from Steam or whatever on multiple computers. Like, what a ridiculous idea.
I mean, it's not as hot button cool dude as owning all the SJWs,
I guess I can't argue with that.
Why complain about DRM when you can complain about all the
We just need a 3-letter acronym at any given time. No, people
right.
still get pissed about de novo, which is kind of Secure ROM's took up the mantle from Secure ROM. Because again, it's another thing that people claim slows down performance, because it does a lot of constant checking that you're authorized to have the software kind of thing. So people really hate de novo too. But I definitely have read some stuff. De novo for a while was very difficult to crack. To get past, if you're not familiar with the lingo. There are always people trying to crack DRM so that things can be pirated, basically. But I have read before that, so now de novo gets cracked within hours or days on any given game. But I have read that those hours, just getting to 24 hours before it gets cracked actually makes a major, major difference for publishers in terms of piracy. Which is wild to me, but also, I guess, indicates the, patience level of many pirates.
Yeah. I know just, comparing releasing an app on iOS versus releasing an app on Android. Android is generally pirated immediately. So, when you release something on Android, it's not necessarily to make sales. Because you won't. Specifically because, something about the different security protocols on Android versus iOS is just, Android is just rife with piracy. So, you're not going to be making very much money off your Android port.
Well, I didn't realize either that Steam was originally a super invasive thing that Valve created. Did you know that you bought Half-Life 2 and then you had to download Steam to play?
Yeah.
Which I can imagine just being what the heck is this? Why are you making me do this? But because everybody wanted to play Half-Life 2, they did it.
Yeah. I mean, before that, Steam used to be a way to get updates for their games, though. So it wasn't a totally unknown thing. But certainly the fact that they required it alongside a game that is particularly popular helped to normalize it almost immediately. Nintendo Vault. Nothing. I'm just thinking about how they're releasing their Mario All-Stars in a timed limit, and that's kind of skeevy, but everybody's buying that anyway because they want to play those games.
It will be interesting to me how the Mario All-Stars, what the sales look like on that, as opposed to, obviously there's no way to know, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder what Nintendo sales look like, whatever, it'll be 6 months, right? After 6 months of a game, for Mario games. I'm sure what they're doing is they're going to split it apart, right? It doesn't make sense for them to not be splitting it apart into multiple games. It doesn't. I have to believe that doesn't make any sense.
As far as most reviews are concerned, they did not do very much work on these games. In terms of updating them to Switch. 64 doesn't have widescreen support. Sunshine has a ton of new bugs, it seems in the Switch version. So it doesn't seem like, they just seem like they've released them so that you can play them on Switch, and haven't put much work into them besides that. So it seems possible to me that they will just stop selling it.
Then I'll be interested to see when people, I wish I could see a graph of when people buy that game. Because right now I feel like I haven't seen the impact of the limited, presumably the people that have bought it up to this point probably would have bought it anyway.
Sure.
And it'll be
I
interesting
imagine,
to me to see
just from a layman's terms, I imagine it's going to be a lot of people bought it when it released, it'll go down a little bit, they'll release a reminder a week beforehand, and sales will suddenly shoot up again.
It's interesting to me. It's hard for me to imagine that selling more games than leaving this Mario compilation available forever. But obviously they have something in mind here.
I mean, I'm just thinking about it in terms of, like, Steam, but Valve managed to normalize this Steam process, specifically through releasing a game that everybody wanted, and making that a requirement of it. And even if there was some grumbling about it, it eventually died down because everybody was playing Half-Life 2, and that's really all they cared about.
Well, I guess we'll see if timed limited releases become a thing.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to imagine, but I'm sure it would have been hard for me to imagine, the perpetual, forever, everywhere DRM that exists on digital games now. Unless you buy them on GOG, where it's DRM free. Although even there, it still looks like they claim that you own your game.
And I'm pretty sure itch.io is DRM free also.
Even on those sites, even though they make a big deal out of you owning your game, it still doesn't seem to me like you really it's still a license.
I guess, but it's more a license in the sense of your physical games license.
That's true.
When I download, itch.io does have a client they can use to help you manage things, but when I buy something on itch.io, I can just download it onto my computer in a file and put that file on a hard drive and sell that hard drive. It's harder to do that with games that you've purchased on Steam.
That's true. That's absolutely true. Okay, so let's say that I do, whatever, Emma. I don't care. I don't care if I just have a license to the game. Big deal. It's just like owning the game. I mostly don't play games that I've finished again anyway, and I wouldn't go to the hassle of reselling it even if I wanted to. Big deal if I can't play it in 20 years. Blah, blah, blah. I'm gonna go mod my game now. Later.
Okay.
Wrong. Bad. Illegal. So not only folks do you not own your games, you just own a license. Because you only have a license, there's a lot of stuff that you're not really allowed to do in your games.
Sure. I mean, I think of modding as something similar to fan art, fan fiction, fan work, right? Sure, it's not allowed, but it's so prevalent that it unless you're really gung-ho about it, is very uncommon for anyone to be really taken down over that.
That's true, but I don't know who knows how much of that will hold up over time, is what I'll say. Epic Games certainly seems to have designs on not allowing any of this stuff in any capacity at all.
Sure. I guess I wasn't considering PvP games, where it is a much bigger deal.
Fair.
I don't think the makers of Skyrim are gonna come after you for the mod that turns spiders into bears or something.
So that's true, and they certainly haven't up to this case. I'm just saying, listeners, technically, modding really does exist in kind of a legal gray space. In that most of the time, it's good press for publishers, right? When a mod, blows up for whatever reason. So they're not interested in policing it. But they probably could. And it's unclear whether you would be able, the terms of use that you signed mean that you probably are breaking your contract by doing so. Which, it's interesting to, have such a huge community around something like fanfiction, although I think, this even more than fanfiction, because you've theoretically signed a contract saying that you will not do this, is in this real gray space. So now I need to talk about Epic Games and their lawsuit against a 14-year-old.
Feel free.
Like if I were to buy a book, or I don't know, maybe not a movie, but if I were to buy a book and then I wanted to like tear out pages and write annotations on it and whatever, I'd be allowed to do that. Nobody's going to stop me from doing that. That's allowed. But you can't do, just because you bought, quote unquote, a game, you can't do anything you want to it. And that becomes especially relevant, as Emma said, in online PvP games. So you might have heard a couple years ago about Epic Games suing a 14-year-old called CR. Not for, like, Epic had a bunch of Fortnite-related lawsuits, and we're not even thinking about the Apple one right now. But they had a bunch of Fortnite-relating cheating lawsuits a couple of years ago, mostly targeting people who, coded the cheats. But this is the one that was against a cheater pumpkin eater, which is, I wouldn't be surprised if Epic literally referred to this dude as cheater pumpkin eater in their, suit.
They would make, a whole ad about him and host a screening event for it.
If it had happened today, they probably would have.
Uh-huh.
Like an evil fan cam.
Yeah.
Of this guy's greatest cheating hits. Anyway, this kid did not create the cheat, right? He was not the person, selling or distributing the cheat beyond putting it in the link to it in the description of his YouTube video. He just made a YouTube video for his 8,000 subscribers demonstrating how to use this cheat in Fortnite. Which was then, and where this escalated, is it got taken down by YouTube, and Epic realized that he was cheating, and so because of that, the video wasn't just pulled down as a copyright strike for a certain number of days. It was pulled down indefinitely, and then this kid kept uploading videos of him cheating, and it led to this lawsuit. Where basically he was being sued for breaking the terms of service that he agreed to, and for copyright infringement because he's injecting new code into the game and altering it without the creator's consent.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure you read in those terms of service you're not allowed to do.
Yeah.
But what's especially tricky about those terms of service, especially with a game like Fortnite, that is, of course, played by many, many people of minor age, is that those terms, you are not really allowed to sign a legally binding contract until you are an adult, until you are 18 years old. And if you're not 18, theoretically something in there that you sign makes you acknowledge that, your parent or guardian has read this.
Yeah.
And that they authorize it. And of course, that never happens.
Yeah, I mean, that gets into, I guess he was 14, which means this wouldn't necessarily apply to him, but parts of that, get into COPPA stuff, too, right?
Yep.
You have to have some sort of thing that's I'm over 13 when you join a social media site, or I think games with online components are also subject to COPPA. Or when the storefronts certainly are subject to COPPA. And I'm sure Fortnite has tons of players who are not older than 13.
So you get into this weird space of, honestly, it's actually, some of their defense in this case was well, he signed this, but, he's not 18. And the problem being that almost puts you in worse legal territory. It's one thing to say this doesn't apply to me because I signed it, but I'm not, really allowed to sign a legally binding contract. But then you're in this, fraud or digital trespassing world that sounds like maybe it's worse than being bound by it somehow and not understanding. But of course the whole internet runs on this, as Emma was saying. Basically, this kind of hold your nose and don't look to parents agreeing to things for their children. But yeah. So they're trying to argue, well, I don't know. Basically by adding a cheat, he creates a derivative work of Fortnite. which maybe is fair use, except that the user agreement says that you can't do that.
Yeah.
So even if you were going to try to, argue that, you sign a contract saying you won't do that. But you definitely read. But anyway, the case is still ongoing, at least as of this fall. And he, or last fall, I haven't seen the updates since then. But he's still posting videos of him cheating.
He is certainly bold.
I mean, like, on one hand, absolutely, he is certainly bold. On the other hand, like, Epic, calm down. What are they going for here?
I don't know. Their law team is busy. Maybe they just forgot it was happening.
They do have a lot going on. Well, Emma, are you ever gonna buy a disk driveless console?
I mean, I sure have considered the Xbox Series S, the teeny Xbox, as I prefer to call it.
The smaller, less powerful box.
Yeah. Specifically because, Game Pass is a very good deal. And Microsoft knows it because as much as there's these, fake console wars going on, Microsoft themselves is not super concerned with beating Sony in console sales, it really seems like. Like, they just want you to be on Game Pass, basically. And, in looking for this, I was seeing, all these threads from, last year or a couple years ago that was, digital-only gaming is, if they ever got there, it's so far away, yada, yada, yada. And I agree that digital-only gaming is pretty far away. But, I mean, both these consoles are offering versions that do not have a disc, which means that they're digital-only, and offering these at a cheaper price than the ones that have a disk drive. And particularly for Microsoft, they're not super concerned with selling individual games anymore. They are more concerned with having you sign up for their Netflix, basically. So I don't think that's as far away as some people are claiming that it is, at least having a digital domination, at least.
Yeah, I will say that games are the only form of media that I particularly even try to buy physically anymore.
I own some movies, and obviously I own books.
Well, okay, right. Yeah, I mean, I don't like ebooks, but not, because I don't like reading on e-readers more than I'm worried about having my books forever. But I do feel like, at least in the movie, TV world, I own some movies and I own some TV collections. But very few of those have I gotten recently. And with games are the only thing where it's I would like to buy that physically. And I can't really even put my finger on the reason so much. Maybe I have internalized a little bit of this, you don't own it. And I also think it's because I can often get pretty good deals on used games from GameStop.
For me, it's also space concerns, right?
Yeah.
Because there's no streaming model, or not really a streaming model that I'm interested in. Just downloading your games takes up a lot of space, and I don't want to shell out the money for an extra hard drive for my PlayStation 4. And having the games on disc, the only thing that's taking up space, I think, is the patches that you download. So,
do you think you would save money over time having a console with a disc drive because you can buy used games, or relative to buying the cheaper one?
I mean, it depends. I don't know.
Sorry, that was a big, broad question. I'm asking, for me, personally, do you think I would save money buying a disc drive one?
I think you would save money by waiting at least a year to buy any next-gen console.
That's the plan
figure out all the inevitable bugs that will happen.
Everything's going to be on both consoles. What's the rush?
Yeah, exactly. Series X1 just doesn't have any exclusive launch titles, really. And the PlayStation 5, most of those are also coming out on PlayStation 4. Perhaps with the exception of Demon's Souls. But
I would be bad at that game anyway, so that's fine. Yeah, in researching this, I will say I feel less, I feel sort of bad from the Spotify perspective of, like, I still don't have a good idea how people get compensated for having their game on something like Game Pass.
Yeah.
And I will be dismayed in a few years when I discover that they are not really being compensated in the way that artists are not really being compensated on Spotify. The more that I think about the fact that I don't really own any digital games to begin with, the more it's like, oh, okay, like, what's the big deal of taking a half a step further to Game Pass, where it's a little more upfront about the fact that I don't really own the games.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the danger of it, right? But still.
And yet, there's that little nagging voice that's you in the back of my head going, but Madelyn, games preservation.
So streaming services obviously are one thing, and if streaming services become dominant, that's going to be an issue for games preservation, certainly. But I was reading that it's not necessarily games being digital that's the problem with games preservation. It's more the problem of, I think even more recently than there were digital games, is games are now tied to your user account, as opposed to, like, on the console, if that makes sense. I didn't go as deep into it because this isn't a game preservation episode, and this is sort of a tangentially related topic, but, like, if the game is tied to your user account, it's not, like, stored as much so that anybody can access it. So, like, the Wii Store, like, most of the Wii Store, when it went offline, was already preserved. Because you could just get, like, big Wiis that had a ton of games on them. Whereas now it's more, there's less of that, I guess, because it's your user account. You don't necessarily have, like, all your mobile games downloaded onto a phone, so you can't just get, like, a phone from a used store that has a ton of games on it, because you don't have those downloaded, right? At least that was my basic understanding of the thing I skimmed over.
Yeah, and, that's where all this DRM stuff becomes a problem. Not just in terms of being tied to user accounts, but also in terms of the DRM service itself. Not even, like, the publisher or, like, where you got the game or anything like that, but, like, when Secure ROM shut down, there were some games that became glitchy to play until somebody fixed it.
Yeah.
Or if somebody bothered to fix it.
Yeah, there was a Tron game on Steam that Disney basically let its Secure ROM subscription or license expire, which means that you couldn't download it anymore, basically, even if you had previously bought it, because the Secure ROM wasn't working anymore. And there's basically nothing you could do about that. I also was thinking about it. I'm sure that most of game preservation efforts exist in this sort of legal gray area, right? Because physical media does have an expiration date. DVDs eventually warp, batteries run out, various things. We don't know if Blu-rays will ever die because they're too new to know that, but they probably will. So I imagine that a lot of preservation is, like, ripping those off of the CD, which I'm sure is not legal. So regardless of that, like, there's just, game preservation is its own can of worms in terms of the industry not being friendly to that.
And you should listen to our podcast on it from however many months ago.
Yeah.
Well, Emma, any other thoughts about owning games?
Bye, GameStop. It's good to know ya. Soon you will be just the Funko Pop store.
That's not true. I bought you Kingdom Hearts socks at Games.
You're right.
The Advent calendar.
There'll be the sock, Advent calendar, and Funko Pop store. But no, seriously, like, I have been trying to buy less from Amazon and buy more locally. But there's not great options, especially in a pandemic, for buying games locally. So when GameStop goes away, there will really only be pretty much big businesses. Not that GameStop isn't a big business, but it's more of a Barnes & Noble-y kind of business.
Yeah, I know. It's like, I feel better buying from Bed Bath & Beyond than I do from Amazon.
Yeah.
For, like, no reason, except that it's not. Yeah.
So that'll be sad in its own way, even though GameStop is not a great company either.
But they're an essential business, Emma.
Yeah. Yep. Huh?
Well, folks, have you considered whether the majority of the games you own are digital or physical? I'm just considering it right now. I don't know. I don't own that many digital games relative to, like, obviously yours are mostly digital, but
I gave you a lot of my games.
Even if you considered those to be shared games of yours, let's say.
I mean, I own a lot of physical games. If a game is physical, I will buy it physically almost every time.
I did do that until the pandemic, when, like, there was no way for me to get Animal Crossing. And now I've bought more digital games.
See, I own Animal Crossing physically.
Ooh, aren't you cool?
I'm very cool.
Your office right next to a GameStop. Wow.
Not anymore.
Anyway, listeners, have you thought about, like, what percentage of your library is physical versus digital? What's the calculus for you when deciding whether to get that physical edition or that collector's edition or that digital collector's edition? Are you worried about DRM? Do you have any horror stories with downloading games that then were no longer listed? Will you be playing nothing but Game Pass from now on?
You know, I wonder about, like, digital collector's editions. Does the DRM stuff, like, also apply to the, like, digital... Like, what can you do with, like, the digital art book and the digital soundtrack? I wonder.
Gonna have to do a little more research. But if you have thoughts on any of that, or if you're those lawyers or tech people from the beginning of the episode who are ready to put us in our place, you should follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast, where you can find our thoughts on various games and game news, sometimes memes, and updates on what's going on our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read more about the show, more about us, check out the episode archives, and read our blog, where you can see long-running series, now on hiatus, Clickbait Boyfriend, where my boyfriend has played all of the Kingdom Hearts games, and Split Screen, where Emma and I are watching My Hero Academia and Coffee Prince. As well as various and sundry other blogs of past, present, and future. You should also, and most importantly, if you enjoyed the show, subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Cast, anywhere you can find podcasts. You can find Talk This. I almost messed up that patter there because I said Apple Podcast as opposed to Apple Podcasts, and I heard myself do it, and I, like, almost lost track of just the word vomit that I spew about subscribing. And if you love that word vomit, you don't want to miss it on Sundays at noon, so you better be subscribed to the show. Emma, remind the people what we're talking about next week. I remember that they were not going to mash well, although I think I feel that way every week.
Yeah, I think you do feel that way every week, and sometimes you're correct and sometimes you are wrong. By the way, you cannot own our podcast. We are only streaming.
That's true. Well, couldn't you download the file? I don't know what you could do with the iTunes files. I feel like you would probably rip that away.
I guess that would be illegal, though, I assume.
That's fine, though. You can do it if you want.
I mean, sure, do it. It's free. It doesn't really matter to us. Next time we are talking about Fable and Valorant.
Right. The fabled Valor Ant. I remember saying that last week.
Yes, I remember you saying that too.
Well, folks, you should tune in for that next week, and then in 2 weeks, it's that time where we download our saved data, which, by the way, also mostly lives in the cloud these days, right? RIP memory cards. And we'll talk about what we've been playing these last 6 weeks. I feel like it'll be an interesting and varied thing, and for once, I won't have Animal Crossing to talk about, probably, unless I get back into it in the next 2 weeks. So you'll want to tune in for some fresh new gaming content. You made a face.
I didn't.
Because you made a face, you have to say goodbye to the listeners. Folks, thanks for listening to Talk This. We always have fun here on the show, even when we're talking about topics that Emma suggests and then says are boring every day until we record about them. So, Emma, why don't you wish the listeners, good tidings?
Listeners, I hope you have a good momentary existence in this transitory world this week.